He stood on the marble balcony of the sprawling Hamptons estate, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Scotch, laughing as private security dragged his wife of 20 years down the gravel driveway. Richard Sterling thought he had won. He thought his ironclad prenup and his army of lawyers made him untouchable. But Richard made one fatal miscalculation, a detail buried so deep in the paperwork he never bothered to read. He forgot who the ground beneath his feet actually belonged to. In this story of greed, betrayal, and the ultimate cold-served revenge, you'll see how a quiet, disregarded housewife turned the tables on a narcissistic tycoon, leaving him with nothing but the suit on his back. This isn't just a divorce. It's an eviction notice from hell. Buckle up. The champagne in Richard Sterling's glass was worth more than most people's cars. It was a chilled 1998 Dom Perignon, and it tasted like victory. Richard stood in the center of the great room of the Sterling estate, a monstrosity of limestone and glass overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in East Hampton. The room was buzzing with the low hum of high society chatter. It was his 50th birthday, but it felt more like a coronation. His tech firm, Sterling Dynamics, had just closed a merger that pushed his net worth into the billions. He adjusted his bespoke Italian suit, catching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked good. Trim, silver fox hair, a jawline that defied his age. He looked like a man who owned the world. And in his mind, he did. "Richard, darling, the guests are waiting for the toast," a voice purred beside him. It wasn't his wife. It was Jessica Vane, 26 years old, a former swimsuit model turned social media consultant for his firm. She was wearing a red dress that was less of a garment and more of a declaration of war. She clung to his arm, her diamond bracelet, a gift he'd bought yesterday, catching the light. "Let them wait, Jess," Richard smirked, looking out over the manicured lawns. "I want to savor this view. It's good to be king." In the corner of the room, standing near the entrance to the kitchen, was Catherine Sterling. She was 48, though the stress of the last few years made her look older. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress that Richard had called frumpy earlier that morning. She held a tray of hors d'oeuvres, not because she had to, they had a staff of 30, but because she needed something to do with her hands to stop them from shaking. Catherine had been with Richard since before the money. She had been there when they were eating instant noodles in a basement apartment in Queens. She had proofread his first business plans. She had nursed him through the ulcers and the panic attacks in the early days. But Catherine was quiet. She was the background noise to Richard's symphony. Over the years, as the zeros in their bank account grew, Richard's respect for her had diminished. He saw her silence as weakness. He saw her kindness as a lack of ambition. "Look at her," Richard whispered to Jessica, not bothering to lower his voice much. He nodded toward Catherine. "She looks like she belongs to the catering staff." Jessica giggled, a sharp, cruel sound. "Oh, stop it, Richard. She's trying." "She's existing," Richard corrected coldly, "and I'm tired of paying for her existence." The plan had been in motion for months. Richard was a man who optimized everything: his tax returns, his workout routine, his workforce. Now, he was optimizing his personal life. He had spoken to his lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, 3 weeks ago. "The prenup is 20 years old, Richard," Arthur had warned. "It might be contested." "I don't care," Richard had snapped. "I want her out. Jessica is moving in next week. I want Catherine gone by the end of the party. It's my birthday gift to myself." It was cruel. It was psychotic. But Richard Sterling didn't deal in empathy. He dealt in leverage, and he believed he held all the cards. He owned the accounts. He was the face of the company. This mansion, with its 12 bedrooms and private beach access, bore his name on the brass plaque at the gate, the Sterling estate. He walked over to the center of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The room fell silent. 200 of New York's elite turned to face him. Senators, hedge fund managers, tech moguls. Friends, partners, competitors, Richard boomed, flashing his $1,000,000 smile. Thank you for coming to celebrate half a century of, well, me winning. Laughter rippled through the crowd. They say behind every great man is a great woman, Richard continued, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Jessica. He extended a hand to her. And I think it's time I finally acknowledged the future of this family. Jessica, come here. The room went deadly quiet. Everyone knew Catherine. Everyone knew she was standing 20 feet away, holding a tray of crab cakes. The humiliation was palpable. It hung in the air like smoke. Catherine didn't move. She didn't drop the tray. She just watched. Her eyes were dry. There was a strange stillness to her, a rigidity that Richard mistook for shock. And to my past, Richard said, turning his cold gaze onto Catherine. He didn't invite her up. He didn't smile. Catherine, we've had a long run. But as businesses pivot, so must people. You've been adequate. But I think we both know it's time for you to retire. He snapped his fingers. 2 burly men in dark suits, private security he had hired specifically for this moment, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. They marched toward Catherine. The guests gasped. Someone dropped a glass. "Richard, what are you doing?" a senator's wife whispered, horrified. "I'm cleaning house," Richard declared, his voice booming with arrogance. "Catherine, Arthur has the papers. You're leaving. Now, security will escort you off the premises. Don't worry. I've booked you an Uber." The silence in the great room was deafening, broken only by the heavy footsteps of the security guards closing in on Catherine. Most women would have screamed. Most would have thrown the tray of crab cakes at his head. Most would have cried, begged, or made a scene. Richard was counting on a scene. He wanted her to look crazy. He wanted to look like the calm, rational victim of a hysterical woman. But Catherine Sterling did none of those things. She gently placed the silver tray on a nearby side table. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at the security guards, men twice her size, and then she looked at Richard. Her expression wasn't one of sadness. It was one of pity. "You're making a mistake, Richard," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the pin-drop silence of the room, it carried to the rafters. "The only mistake I made was not doing this 5 years ago," Richard laughed, wrapping his arm around Jessica's waist. "Get her out of here. She's trespassing." One of the guards reached for Catherine's arm. "Ma'am, please come with us. Don't make this difficult." Catherine pulled her arm back, a flash of steel in her eyes that Richard had never seen before. "I can walk by myself," she said. She turned and began to walk toward the massive oak double doors. She didn't look back at the friends she had hosted for years, people who were now averting their eyes, too cowardly to intervene. She didn't look at the crystal chandelier she had spent months sourcing in Italy. She walked with her head high. As she stepped out into the cool evening air of the Hamptons, Richard followed her out onto the balcony, Jessica in tow, the guests spilling out behind them like spectators at a gladiator match. Richard wanted the final word. He leaned over the stone railing. "Don't bother coming back for your clothes, Catherine," he shouted down at her small figure on the driveway. "I'll have them sent to, well, wherever you end up. Probably your sister's couch in Jersey." Jessica laughed, sipping her champagne. "Bye, Catherine." Catherine stopped. She stood on the gravel driveway, the massive estate looming over her. The house was lit up like a palace, glowing gold against the twilight. It was magnificent, and it was hostile. She reached into her purse. Richard tensed. Was she pulling a gun? A rock? She pulled out a phone. She dialed a number, put it to her ear, and looked directly up at the balcony, locking eyes with Richard. She didn't say a word to him. She just spoke into the phone. "It's done," she said. "Execute the protocol. Shut it all down." She hung up, turned around, and walked through the iron gates. Richard frowned, a flicker of unease touching the back of his neck. "What was that?" "She's bluffing," Jessica said, nuzzling his neck. "Just trying to be dramatic. She has no power, Richard. You stripped her accounts this morning, remember? She doesn't even have a credit card that works." Richard nodded, relaxing. "You're right. She's nothing. Just a ghost." He turned back to his guests, throwing his arms wide. "Everyone, the show is over. The glitch has been removed. Let's drink. The night is young, and I am a free man." The music started up again, a heavy bass beat that shook the floorboards. The party resumed, louder and more frantic than before, as if everyone was trying to drink away the memory of what they had just witnessed. But down at the gate, Catherine didn't get into an Uber. A black Bentley Mulsanne pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. He was older, perhaps 70, wearing a three-piece tweed suit and holding a cane. This was Arthur Pendleton. Richard's lawyer? No, this was Lawrence Pendleton, Arthur's father, the founder of the firm, a man who had technically retired 10 years ago. A man Richard is terrified of. Lawrence bowed his head to Catherine. "Mrs. Sterling, I trust the performance went as predicted?" Catherine slid into the leather back seat, her face finally crumbling just a fraction, a single tear escaping. She wiped it away instantly. "He was exactly who I thought he was, Lawrence," Catherine said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He threw me out like garbage." Lawrence closed the door and got in beside her. "Then he has sealed his fate. Did he sign the separation notice?" "He announced it in front of 200 witnesses," Catherine said. "He declared the marriage over and evicted me, publicly." Lawrence smiled, a shark-like grin that was far more dangerous than anything Richard could muster. "Excellent. That constitutes constructive abandonment and irretrievable breakdown initiated by him. It triggers the clauses in the trust." "Is everything ready?" Catherine asked. "The utilities are already being contacted," Lawrence said, checking his pocket watch. "The bank freeze will hit in approximately 12 minutes. And the sheriff, well, I have the sheriff meeting us at the diner down the road. He's very interested to hear about the trespassing incident." Catherine looked confused. "Trespassing? But I just left." Lawrence looked at her, his eyes twinkling with legal malice. "No, my dear. He is trespassing. Richard seems to have forgotten the history of Harrington land. He thinks he owns the Sterling estate. But he forgets. The house sits on Harrington soil, and the lease he signed 20 years ago. It just expired the moment he dissolved the marriage." Catherine looked back at the mansion, glowing on the hill. "Drive," she said. 30 minutes had passed since Catherine's departure. The party was reaching a fever pitch. Richard Sterling was holding court near the ice sculpture, carved in the shape of a dollar sign, recounting the story of his latest acquisition to a group of sycophants. "So I told the board," Richard laughed, swirling his glass. "You can either take the buyout, or I can bleed your stock dry until you're begging me to take it for pennies. It's not personal. It's just gravity." Jessica was draped over his shoulder, taking a selfie. "#power couple," she chirped, hitting the post. Suddenly the music cut out. It wasn't a faded out, it was a dead stop. A split second later, The massive crystal chandelier above them flickered once, buzzing like an angry hornet, and then died. The recessed lighting followed, the landscape lights outside, illuminating the gardens and the infinity pool, plunged into darkness. The entire estate went pitch black. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the nervous laughter started. "Did you forget to pay the bill, Richard?" a hedge fund manager joked from the darkness. "Very funny, Tom," Richard snapped, his voice tight. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the smoky room. "It's just a blown fuse. The sound system probably drew too much power. Where is the house manager? Stevens?" Stevens, the butler, appeared from the gloom, holding a lighter. "Sir?" "Get the generator running. We have a backup system for a reason. Why didn't it kick in automatically?" I don't know, sir," Stevens stammered. "I'll go check the breaker panel in the basement." Richard scoffed. "Useless. Everyone, calm down. Just a technical hiccup. The champagne is still cold." But the champagne wasn't the only thing cooling down, or rather, warming up. The hum of the central air conditioning had ceased. In a glass box filled with 200 people in mid-July, the temperature began to rise immediately. 10 minutes passed. No lights. No music. The guests were using their phone screens to illuminate the room, casting eerie, ghost-like shadows on the walls. The laughter was dying down, replaced by murmurs of annoyance. Stevens came running back up the stairs, looking pale in the flashlight beam. "Sir," he whispered urgently, "the breakers are fine. The main line has been cut." "Cut? What do you mean cut? Like a storm?" "No, sir. Hard cut. From the street. And the generator. It's not working. The fuel line seems to be locked out digitally." Richard felt a vein throb in his temple. "That's impossible. Call the power company. Tell them who I am. Tell them I'll sue them into the Stone Age if the lights aren't on in 5 minutes." "I tried, sir," Stevens said, his voice trembling. "There's no signal." "What?" "The Wi-Fi is down, and nobody has cell service. It's like we're in a dead zone." Richard looked at his phone. No service. He looked at Jessica's phone. Searching. "This is ridiculous," Richard growled. He stormed toward the kitchen. "At least get the appetizers circulating. People are hungry." He pushed open the kitchen doors. The staff was standing around in the dark, looking helpless. The head chef looked furious. "Mr. Sterling," the chef said, pointing to the sink. The water stopped. The water? Completely dry. "I can't wash the dishes. The toilets won't flush. The ice machine is melting." Richard froze. Power, internet, water. All gone in the span of 20 minutes. This wasn't a fuse. This was a siege. "It's her!" Jessica shrieked from the doorway, her voice shrill in the quiet house. "That witch did something." "Don't be stupid, Jessica," Richard snapped, though a cold knot of dread was forming in his stomach. Catherine doesn't know how to change a light bulb, let alone cut the main power grid. This is a municipal failure. He needed to regain control. He marched back into the great room. The air was getting stiflingly hot. Guests were fanning themselves with napkins. Some were already heading for the doors. "Everyone," Richard shouted, "please bear with us. Just a local outage. In the meantime, I have a special surprise. I ordered 5 cases of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. I was saving it for midnight, but let's crack it now. Cheers." Richard knew how to buy affection. He turned to Stevens. "Go to the wine cellar. Bring the vintage cases." "Sir," Stevens hesitated. "The wine cellar has an electronic biometric lock. It requires power to open." Richard stared at him. "Use the key." "You have the only physical override key, sir. It was on your keychain." Richard patted his pockets. He froze. His keychain, the one with the car keys, the office keys, and the wine cellar key usually sat in the valet bowl by the front door. He ran to the front hall. The bowl was empty. "Looking for these?" Richard spun around. Jessica was holding his keychain. "I found them on the floor earlier. I thought you dropped them." "Give them to me." Richard snatched the keys and fumbled for the small brass key for the cellar. It wasn't there. The ring was there. The fob for his Porsche was there. But the brass key was gone. And so was the key to the master safe. "Where is it?" Richard hissed, grabbing Jessica's wrist. "I don't know. That's how I found them," Jessica cried, pulling away. A heavy, suffocating realization crashed down on Richard. Catherine hadn't just walked out. She had prepared. She had taken the specific keys. She had timed the outage. "Mr. Sterling?" It was the valet captain standing at the front door. "Sir, the guests are trying to leave, but the electric gates, they're shut tight. And without power, they won't open. The manual release lever, it's missing." Panic began to ripple through the crowd. They were trapped, in the dark, with no water, in a house that was rapidly becoming a sauna. "Open the gates!" a senator shouted, his face red in the flashlight beam. "Ram them if you have to!" "My Bentley is not ramming an iron gate!" someone else yelled. Richard stood in the center of the chaos, his $5,000 suit sticking to his back with sweat. His kingdom was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. Then, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, blue and red lights flashed against the darkness. "Police." Richard let out a breath of relief. "Thank God. The police are here. They'll open the gates. They probably came because of the alarm system failure." He adjusted his tie, regained his composure, and walked toward the front door. "Let me handle this," he told the panicked guests. "The authorities are here to assist." He opened the massive front door. A sheriff's cruiser was parked right up against the iron gates. 2 deputies were using a bolt cutter to snap the chain on the pedestrian entrance. "Officers," Richard called out, jogging down the driveway, waving his arms. "Over here. We have a situation. Someone has sabotaged the estate." The sheriff, a tall man with a flat-brimmed hat and a face carved from granite, walked through the pedestrian gate. He didn't look like he was there to help. He looked like he was there to hunt. "Are you Richard Sterling?" the sheriff asked, his hand resting on his belt. "I am," Richard said, putting on his best, important man voice. "And I demand you find my wife. She's behind this. She's tampered with the utilities and locked us in. I want her arrested for vandalism and endangerment." The sheriff ignored him. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Sheriff Miller. I'm not here to arrest your wife." He stepped closer into the circle of light from the flashlights. "I'm here to serve you." Richard blinked, the strobe of the police lights reflecting in his confused eyes. "Serve me? What are you talking about? I'm the victim here." Sheriff Miller didn't blink. He handed the document to Richard. "This is a temporary restraining order and a notice to vacate regarding the property known as Parcel 4B, historically known as the Harrington Grounds." "Vacate?" Richard laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Sheriff, you must be new. I own this house. I built this house. My name is on the gate." "Your name is on the gate," the sheriff agreed calmly. "But you don't own the land the gate sits on. And in this county, land law is very specific." Richard tried to read the document in the flickering light. The legal jargon was dense, but phrases like terminated lease agreement and unauthorized occupancy jumped out at him. "This is a mistake," Richard said, shaking his head. "My lawyer drew up the contracts when we built this place 20 years ago. It's all in the Sterling Trust." "I suggest you call your lawyer then," Sheriff Miller said, "because according to the county recorder, who I spoke to 10 minutes ago, the land belongs to the Harrington Family Trust, specifically Catherine Harrington Sterling, You signed a 99-year ground lease. Yes, Richard exclaimed. Exactly. A 99-year lease. I have 79 years left. You can't kick me out? Read Clause 14, subsection B, the sheriff said, shining his own flashlight onto the paper in Richard's hand. Richard squinted. In the event that the lessee, Richard Sterling, initiates divorce proceedings, separates from, or forcefully removes the landowner, Catherine Sterling, from the premises, the ground lease shall immediately terminate, and the land shall revert to full exclusivity of the Harrington Trust. Any structures remaining on the land become the property of the landowner after 24 hours unless removed. Richard stopped reading. The blood drained from his face. She can't do this, he whispered. This clause, I never saw this. It was signed by you, Mr. Sterling, the sheriff said. August 14th, 2004. I signed a stack of papers this high, Richard shouted, gesturing wildly. I didn't read every fine print footnote. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, the sheriff said. Now here is the situation. Mrs. Sterling has reported that you forcefully removed her from the property tonight. Is that true? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. 200 guests had watched him do it. That was a marital dispute. Richard tried to pivot. Witnesses say you had security drag her out, the sheriff said. That triggers the clause. The lease is dead. You are currently trespassing on private property. This is my house, Richard roared, losing his composure. I paid for the bricks. I paid for the marble. Technically, the sheriff drawled, you own a pile of bricks sitting on someone else's dirt, and she wants you off her dirt. Now, and if I refuse? Then I will arrest you for criminal trespass, and I have orders to tow every vehicle currently illegally parked on Harrington land. Richard looked back at the driveway. It was filled with Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Bentleys belonging to the most powerful people in New York. If those cars got towed because he didn't own his own driveway, his reputation would be incinerated. Fine, Richard hissed. Fine. I'll call my lawyer. We'll sort this out in the morning. No. The sheriff stepped forward, invading Richard's personal space. Not in the morning. Mrs. Sterling has invoked the immediate vacancy protocol due to, what did she call it? Hostile threat. You have 30 minutes to clear the premises. You and your guests. 30 minutes? It's a blackout. The gates are locked. I have a bolt cutter, the sheriff said dryly, and I suggest you tell your guests to walk carefully. The tow trucks are 5 minutes out. Richard pulled out his phone. He needed Arthur. He needed his bulldog. He ran back toward the house, searching for a signal. He found one bar near the fountain. He dialed Arthur's number furiously. Arthur, pick up, you old fool, Arthur answered on the second ring. Richard, I'm having dinner. What is it? Catherine, Richard sputtered. The sheriff is here. They're saying I don't own the land. They're saying the lease is tied to the marriage. Arthur, you wrote the damn prenup. Fix this. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard, Arthur said slowly, I didn't write the land lease. My father did. Lawrence. Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the AC being off. What are you talking about? When you bought the property, Arthur explained, his voice sounding tired, you were over-leveraged. You didn't have the cash for the land and the build. Catherine's father offered the land as a wedding gift, but he put it in a trust. My father, Lawrence, handled the paperwork for the Harringtons. I handled the business side for you. Why didn't you warn me about the divorce clause? Richard screamed. Because, Arthur sighed, at the time you told me, and I quote, I'm going to love this woman forever, Arthur. Sign whatever they want, I just want to build the house. Richard leaned against the cold stone of the fountain, feeling sick. He remembered. He had been young, in love, or at least in love with the idea of being a power couple. He had been so arrogant, so sure that he would always be the one calling the shots. "Arthur, find a loophole," Richard begged. "I have 200 people here. The power is cut. The water is off. I look like a clown." "The power?" Arthur paused. "Richard, if the power is off, that means she cut the easements. The utility lines run through the back acre, which she also owns separately. Richard, you're completely encircled. She owns the road access, the utility lines, and the ground under the house." "What do I do?" "Leave," Arthur said. "Grab your checkbook and leave. If Lawrence is behind this, you've already lost the battle. We need to regroup for the war." Richard hung up. He walked back into the house. It was chaos. People were using the light from their phones to find their coats. Jessica was screaming at a waiter because she couldn't find her purse in the dark. "Richard!" Jessica ran up to him, grabbing his lapels. "This is insane! Do something! Tell them who you are!" Richard looked at her, really looked at her. In the harsh light of the flashlight, without the filters and the makeup artists, she looked young, petulant, and useless. She wasn't a partner. She was a liability. And Catherine? Catherine was somewhere out there in the dark, pulling the strings of his life like a puppet master. "Get out!" Richard said to Jessica. "What?" "Get out!" Richard roared, startling the room into silence. "Everyone, the party is over. The police are opening the gates. Get your cars and go, or they will be towed." "Richard, what about us?" Jessica cried. "Where are we going to sleep?" Richard looked around his dark, silent mansion. The mansion he had built to impress the world. The mansion that was now just a pile of rocks on someone else's dirt. "I don't know where you are sleeping," Richard spat, pushing past her. "But I'm going to a hotel." As the guests fled, stumbling in the dark, cursing Richard's name, Richard went upstairs to his master bedroom. He needed his safety. He needed his cash, his passports, his backup hard drives. He fumbled his way into the closet. He reached for the hidden panel behind the suits. He punched in the code. Error. He punched it in again. Error. The safe was electronic. It was wired into the house's smart system. Without power, the safe remained locked. Richard Sterling, the man worth $2 billion, stood in the dark, sweating, defeated, unable to access a single cent of his liquid assets. He kicked the wall, screaming into the void. But the void didn't care. The void belonged to Catherine. The presidential suite at the Plaza Hotel was luxurious, costing $30,000 a night, but to Richard Sterling, it felt like a prison cell with thread count. It was 8:02 a.m. the morning after the birthday massacre, as the tabloids were already calling it. Richard sat in a bathrobe, staring at the front page of the New York Post. Billionaire booted. "Wife owns the dirt. Hubby gets the hurt." The photo was grainy, taken by a guest's phone, showing Richard arguing with Sheriff Miller at the gates, while his guests fled in the background. It was humiliating. "Stop reading it, Richard. You're only raising your blood pressure," Jessica said. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through Instagram. Her tone had shifted. Yesterday, she was the purring kitten. Today, she was annoyed. "People are trolling me in the comments. They're calling me the eviction notice. You need to fix this." "I am fixing it," Richard snapped, throwing the paper across the room. There was a knock at the door. It was Arthur Pendleton, his lawyer. Arthur looked like he hadn't slept. He carried a briefcase that looked heavy with bad news. "Coffee," Arthur said, bypassing pleasantries. "Black. Now." Richard poured him a cup. "Tell me you have a judge ready to sign an injunction. Tell me we're storming back in there with the National Guard." Arthur sat down, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a thick envelope. "Richard, we have a problem. A big one. I spoke to Lawrence this morning." "And? Did you tell your father to stop being a senile, vindictive old bat?" "I told him we were prepared to contest the interpretation of the ground lease," Arthur said, rubbing his temples. "But he pointed out a clause I missed. It's called the Chattel Removal Mandate." Richard frowned. "Chattel? That's for furniture. Cows." "In the context of a ground lease," Arthur explained slowly, "anything built on the land by the tenant, that's you, is considered personal property. Since the lease is terminated, you are no longer a tenant. You are an owner of property, stored on someone else's land without permission. So, Arthur slid a document across the coffee table. "Catherine has served you with a formal demand. You have 14 days to remove your property from her land." Richard stared at him. "Remove?" "The house. It's a 20,000 square foot limestone mansion. It has a foundation. You can't just pick it up and put it in a truck." "Legally, that is not her problem," Arthur said. "She wants the land returned to its original state, flat, green, empty. If you do not remove the structure within 14 days, she will charge you a storage fee for every day it remains." "Storage fee?" Richard laughed incredulously. "How much?" $100,000. "A month?" "A day," Arthur corrected. "And if it's not gone in 30 days, the title of the structure forfeits to the landowner as abandoned debris, which she can then demolish at your expense." Richard stood up, his face turning purple. "This is extortion. She's trying to bankrupt me." "She's following the contract you signed," Arthur reminded him. "Richard, you built a castle on sand, literally. We can fight this in court, but it will take years. In the meantime, the fees will pile up, and you can't live there." Richard paced the room, his mind racing. He was a fighter. He had destroyed competitors who were smarter and richer than Catherine. She was just a housewife. She didn't have the stomach for a real war. She was acting on Lawrence's advice, but she would crack under pressure. "She wants a war?" Richard snarled. "I'll give her a war, but not in the courtroom. I'm taking this to the court of public opinion." "Richard, don't," Arthur warned. "Lawrence is smart. He'll have anticipated this. Lawrence is a lawyer. He thinks in contracts. I'm a CEO. I think in narratives." Richard grabbed his phone. "Jessica, get up. Get your makeup on. We're doing an exclusive interview with Primetime News tonight. We're going to paint Catherine as exactly what she is. A bitter, unstable woman who is holding my property hostage because I fell in love with someone younger." Jessica perked up. "TV? Will I have a speaking part?" "You'll cry," Richard directed. "You'll talk about how mean she was to you. We're going to destroy her reputation. By the time I'm done, she won't be able to show her face in the Hamptons. She'll beg me to take the land back, just to stop the harassment." Arthur packed up his briefcase. "I advise against this, Richard. Strongly." "You're fired, Arthur," Richard said coldly. "Get out. If you can't fight, I'll find a lawyer who can." Arthur paused at the door. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and resignation. "Be careful, Richard. The thing about mudslinging is, you lose a lot of ground while you're doing it." The interview aired at 8 p.m. Catherine sat in the small, cozy living room of her sister's house in New Jersey. Lawrence sat in the armchair opposite her, sipping tea. On the television, Richard Sterling looked handsome, grieving, and incredibly convincing. "I built that house for her," Richard was saying to the sympathetic interviewer, wiping a fake tear. "I poured my soul into it. And yes, marriages fail. It's tragic. But to lock me out, to cut the power while 200 innocent people were inside? It was dangerous. It was vindictive. I worry about her mental state. Truly. The camera cut to Jessica, who dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue. She always hated me, Jessica whimpered. I tried to be respectful, but she couldn't handle that Richard was happy. On the screen, the headline flashed, "Billionaire bullied by ex-wife." Catherine watched it without emotion. A week ago, this would have broken her. It would have sent her spiraling into self-doubt. But the moment those security guards had grabbed her arms, something inside Catherine had calcified. "He's good," Catherine said quietly. "He almost makes me believe I'm the villain." "He is playing the only card he has left," Lawrence said. "Narcissism. He believes if he speaks loud enough, the truth will change." "Is it working?" Catherine asked. Lawrence checked his tablet. "Twitter is trending. Justice for Richard is gaining traction. People don't know the law, Catherine. They only see a man locked out of his own home." Catherine stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. "He wants to make this public? Fine. Let's make it public. Release the footage." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? Once it's out, it's out." "He said I was unstable. He said I abandoned him," Catherine said, her voice turning to steel. "Let the world see how I left." Lawrence tapped a button on his tablet. Done. Richard was celebrating in the hotel bar. He had just bought a round of drinks for everyone. He felt the tide turning. His phone was blowing up with support messages from his bros in the business world. "To the comeback," Richard toasted, clinking glasses with Jessica. Suddenly, the bar went quiet. The large TV screens above the bar, which had been playing sports, suddenly switched to a breaking news alert. "We interrupt this broadcast for a developing story regarding the Sterling estate controversy," the anchor announced. "Lawyers for Catherine Sterling have just released unedited security camera footage from the night in question. Warning, the images may be disturbing to some viewers." Richard froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. The footage appeared. It was high-definition video and audio from the Great Room security camera. The world watched Richard Sterling, the charming billionaire from the interview, sneering at his wife. They heard the audio crystal clear. "She looks like she belongs to the catering staff. I'm tired of paying for her existence. Security will escort you off the premises." The bar watched in stunned silence as the two massive guards grabbed the small, dignified woman. They watched Richard laugh on the balcony. They heard him shout, "Don't bother coming back for your clothes. I'll have them sent to, well, wherever you end up." The video ended. The anchor came back on, looking visibly disgusted. A stark contrast to the interview Mr. Sterling gave just hours ago. This video appears to show a premeditated, humiliating eviction of a spouse of 20 years. Richard looked around the bar. The admiration was gone. The patrons were looking at him with open revulsion. A woman at the next table stood up, picked up her drink, and moved to the other side of the room. Jessica looked at her phone. "Richard, look at the comments now." He snatched the phone. "Richard Sterling eyes a monster team. Catherine boycott. Sterling Dynamics." "It doesn't matter," Richard hissed, slamming the phone down. "Internet hate blows over in a week. I still have the company. I still have the money." His phone rang. It wasn't a fan. It was the chairman of the board of Sterling Dynamics. Richard answered, forcing a confident tone. "John, did you see the interview? I think we really controlled the Richard, shut up." John's voice was icy. "The stock dropped 12% in the last 10 minutes. Our major investors are pulling out. They're saying they can't trust a CEO who treats contracts and people like that." "It's a personal matter," Richard argued. It's a liability matter. We're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Don't come in. Join via Zoom. And Richard, get a PR crisis team. A real one." The line went dead. Richard sat there, the walls closing in. He needed cash. He needed to buy his way out of this. He needed to hire the best lawyers in the country to crush Catherine and Lawrence. He opened his banking app on his phone. He went to transfer $5 million from his offshore account in the Caymans, the rainy day fund he had hidden years ago. Account access denied. Reason: frozen by court order. "What?" Richard shrieked. "That's impossible. That account isn't in my name. It's in the shell company." He called the bank in the Caymans. After 5 minutes of screaming at a manager, he got the answer. "Mr. Sterling," the Swiss banker said calmly. The account was opened under the Sterling Family Trust umbrella. Your prenuptial agreement, the one you uploaded to our system 10 years ago to verify source of funds, specifically lists all global assets, known and unknown, as joint property until a separation is finalized. Mrs. Sterling's lawyers faxed us the separation notice this morning. Standard procedure is to freeze everything until a judge divides it. Richard dropped the phone. He had been so obsessed with protecting his money from her that he had tied it all up in complex trusts to avoid taxes. But those trusts required both signatures to dissolve. He had trapped himself. "Richard?" Jessica touched his arm. "My credit card just got declined. I tried to order room service." Richard looked at her. "The accounts are frozen, Jessica." Jessica's face changed. The mask slipped completely. "Frozen? For how long?" "I don't know. A week, a month." Jessica stood up. She grabbed her purse. "I can't do this, Richard. I can't stay in a hotel with no room service and people spitting on us in the lobby." "Where are you going?" Richard demanded. "I have a friend in Miami," Jessica said, not making eye contact. "I'm going to stay there for a while, until things cool down." "You're leaving me?" Richard stood up, knocking his chair over. "Now? When I'm down?" "You said it yourself, Richard," Jessica said coldly, echoing his own words from the video. "As businesses pivot, so must people." She walked out of the bar. Richard was alone. No wife, no mistress, no house, no access to his billions, and a $100,000 a day bill ticking away on a house he couldn't move. He needed to go back. He needed to get into the safe in the house. There was cash there, hard cash, gold bars, and the physical bearer bonds he kept for emergencies. The safe was mechanical and electronic. He could drill it if he had to. He stumbled out of the hotel. He didn't call a limo. He couldn't pay for it. He called an Uber, linking it to his corporate card, the only one that might still work. "Destination?" the driver asked. "The Sterling estate," Richard muttered. "East Hampton. That place on the news?" The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. "You sure, buddy? I heard they got armed guards there now." "Just drive." 2 hours later, the Uber dropped him off at the bottom of the driveway. The iron gates were closed. The house was dark, looming like a giant tombstone on the hill. But there was a new sign on the gate. A large white sign, illuminated by a solar light. Harrington. "Nature Reserve private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Richard stared at the sign. "Nature Reserve?" He rattled the gates. "Let me in. It's my house." A spotlight hit him from the guard shack. A loudspeaker crackled. "Step away from the gate, Mr. Sterling." "I need to get my things," Richard screamed. "My clothes. My safety." "You have been served a notice," the voice said. "You are permitted entry only with a scheduled appointment and a moving crew to remove the structure. Any attempt to enter otherwise is a felony." Richard grabbed the iron bars, shaking them, screaming until his voice was hoarse. He was a billionaire. He was a king. How was he standing on the side of a road in the middle of the night, locked out of his own life? He saw movement in the window of the guard shack. He squinted against the spotlight. It wasn't a guard. It was Catherine. She was standing there, watching him. She wasn't wearing the frumpy dress anymore. She was wearing a sharp blazer, looking calm, composed, and utterly unreachable. Richard stopped screaming. He locked eyes with her. "Catherine!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Let me in! We can talk! I'll give you whatever you want!" Catherine leaned toward the microphone. Her voice came through the speaker, amplified, booming through the silent woods. "You have nothing I want, Richard," she said, "and you have 13 days to move your rock off my grass. Tick-tock." The spotlight cut out. The darkness swallowed him again. Richard slumped against the gate, sliding down to the gravel. He put his head in his hands. He had lost the battle. Now he had to figure out how to survive the demolition of his ego. The 14-day deadline arrived with the weight of a guillotine blade. For 2 weeks, Richard Sterling had lived a lifetime of desperation. He had called every structural engineering firm on the East Coast. He had screamed at movers. He had tried to bribe city officials to condemn the land so he could seize it back. The answer was always the same. You cannot move a 25,000-square-foot limestone mansion in 2 weeks. It would take 6 months and $5 million to deconstruct it stone by stone. Richard had neither the time nor the money. The sun rose on the 14th day, casting long shadows over the Sterling estate, or rather, the Harrington Nature Reserve. Richard drove up to the gate in a rented Ford Taurus. He wasn't wearing an Italian suit. He was wearing slacks and a dress shirt that hadn't been ironed. He looked 10 years older than he had at his birthday party. The gate opened. This time he was expected. He drove up the long gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires sounding like bones breaking. He parked next to a generic sedan. Standing on the front steps, the steps he had paid to import from Tuscany, were Catherine, Lawrence, and a notary public. Richard got out of the car. He walked up the steps, his legs feeling heavy. He looked at the house. It was still majestic. It was still the symbol of his success. And in exactly 1 hour, it would technically become abandoned debris. "Richard," Catherine said. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him with that same calm, terrifying indifference. "Catherine," Richard croaked. He cleared his throat. I can't move it. You know I can't move it." "I know," she said. "So what do you want?" Richard asked, spreading his hands. "You want to sue me for the storage fees? I don't have the liquid cash, Catherine. The accounts are still frozen. If you sue me, you get nothing." Lawrence stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, we have a different proposal. A settlement." Lawrence placed a single sheet of paper on the small portable table they had set up on the porch. "This is a quitclaim deed," Lawrence explained. "It transfers the ownership of the structure, the house, the pool, the garage, fully to the Harrington Trust. In exchange, Mrs. Sterling agrees to waive the $1.4 million in accrued storage fees and will not pursue you for the cost of demolition." Richard stared at the paper. "You want me to just give you the house? It's worth $30 million. "It's worth nothing if it's on land you don't own," Lawrence countered. "In fact, it's a liability. If you don't sign this by noon, the title forfeits anyway as abandoned property, but you still owe the fees. This way, you walk away with a clean slate. Debt-free, but asset-free." Richard looked at Catherine. "You planned this. From the beginning. You knew I couldn't move it." "I didn't plan for you to cheat on me, Richard," Catherine said softly. I didn't plan for you to humiliate me in front of our friends. I didn't plan for you to discard 20 years of marriage like a used napkin." She took a step closer to him. The scent of her perfume, a scent he had ignored for years, hit him. "I just prepared for the possibility that you were exactly the man I feared you were. And you proved me right." Richard looked at the pen lying on the table. If he signed, he lost the mansion. He lost the symbol of his power. He walked away with nothing but his frozen bank accounts, which would likely be drained in the divorce settlement, and his crumbling reputation. But if he didn't sign, he would be bankrupt by noon. He picked up the pen. His hand shook. He looked up at the balcony where he had stood 2 weeks ago, holding champagne, feeling like a god. He signed his name, Richard Sterling. He put the pen down. It was done. He was no longer the lord of the manor. He was a guest. "Thank you," Lawrence said, snatching the paper away, as if afraid Richard might eat it. "You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises." Richard turned to leave. He stopped and looked back at Catherine. "What will you do with it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You hate this house. You always said it was too big, too cold." "You're right. I do hate it," Catherine said. "That's why I'm not living here." "Then why take it?" "Because," Catherine smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "It's going to make a wonderful women's shelter. The Harrington Sanctuary for Displaced Women. I think it's poetic, don't you? A place built by a man's ego, used to shelter women who have been thrown out by men just like him." Richard felt the color drain from his face. The irony was a physical blow. His palace, his monument to greed, would become a haven for the very victims he despised. "Goodbye, Richard," Catherine said, turning her back on him. "Please shut the gate on your way out." 6 months later, the wind whipped off the Atlantic, cold and biting. Richard stood on the sidewalk in downtown Manhattan, pulling his coat tighter. It was a generic wool coat, bought off the rack. He checked his watch. His lunch break was almost over. He now works as a mid-level consultant for a logistics firm. It was a humiliating drop from the CEO, but after the board fired him and the divorce settlement stripped him of his shares, it was the only job he could get. His name was toxic in the C-suite. He walked past a newsstand. A glossy magazine caught his eye. Architectural Digest. On the cover was a photo of a familiar limestone mansion, but the landscaping was different, softer, more welcoming, and the sign on the gate was clearly visible. The Harrington Sanctuary. The headline read, "From Ruin to Refuge, how Catherine Harrington turned a billionaire's folly into a haven of hope." Richard stared at the photo. Catherine was on the cover, looking radiant, standing next to... Was that Lawrence? No, it was a younger man. An architect. They looked happy. Richard felt a bitterness rise in his throat, but it was dull now. A familiar ache. He had tried to reach out to Jessica a few times, but her number was disconnected. He heard she was dating a cryptocurrency guy in Miami. He looked at his reflection in the shop window. He saw a man who had everything and lost it because he forgot the most basic rule of business and life. Never bite the hand that holds the deed. "Hey, buddy, are you buying that or just blocking the view?" the vendor grunted. Richard looked at the magazine one last time. "No," Richard said, turning away. "I've seen enough." He walked back into the crowd, just another grey suit in a sea of grey suits, disappearing into the city that used to know his name. Back at the estate, Catherine stood on the balcony. The house was full of life. Children playing in the garden, women learning new skills in the library, the kitchen smelling of communal meals. She held a glass of iced tea. She looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the shore, eroding the rocks, reshaping the land. She took a sip, smiled at the horizon, and whispered to the wind, "Checkmate." And that is how Richard Sterling learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Arrogance is a debt that eventually comes due, and usually the interest rate is catastrophic. He thought he was the king because he built the castle, but he forgot that a castle is just a pile of rocks without the land it sits on. Catherine didn't just win the divorce, she rewrote the legacy of the pain he caused her, turning a monument of greed into a sanctuary of hope. It's a brutal reminder to check your paperwork, treat your partners with respect, and never, ever underestimate the person you think you've already defeated. If you enjoyed this story of karma served ice cold, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories about justice, revenge, and the secrets of the ultra-wealthy, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done if you were Catherine? Would you have taken the house, or would you have just bulldozed it to the ground? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video.